Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining our third virtual members meeting. And we hope it's our last virtual members meeting, but this is going to be a great meeting with a great kickoff to start, our keynote. So my only job, and it's a happy one, is to introduce our keynote speaker, Sheila Jasanoff, who is the Pforzheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies at the Harvard Kennedy School. She might be too modest to say so, but she's the founder of what's called Science and Technology Studies. She's a pioneer in the social sciences. Her research explores the role of science and technology in law. She has a law degree from Harvard, in politics, policy of modern democracies. She's the founder and director of the Science and Technology Studies program, STS, at Harvard, and was the founding chair of that department at Cornell. The titles of her two most recent books, I think, kind of set the stage for what she's going to talk about. One that was published in 2016 was The Ethics of Invention, Technology, and the Human Future. And the one that was published in 2019 was called Can Science Make Sense of Life? She's held distinguished visiting professorships really all around the world, many honors, a foreign member of the British Academy and of the Royal Danish Academy, and she was elected earlier this year to the APS. And now I'll turn it over to Sheila Jasanoff.
Yeah, thank you, Linda, for that generous introduction. Let me salute you for your most recent book, Justice on the Brink, which I look forward to reading as soon as the semester ends and we get a little bit of time away from the baggage of the working term. It's really a tremendous honor to be invited to speak to this distinguished audience tonight, even if our gathering is virtual. It also seems the perfect venue for pulling together some of my thoughts on the events of the past year and a half through the twin lenses of constitutionalism and science and technology studies, though Ben Franklin might have been a little surprised to see the mix of those of us who today are bearing the lamps of learning, not to mention how the currents of thought are traveling amongst us in virtual space. The past 20 months have brought untold sorrow and loss to the world and imposed extraordinary burdens on almost every person living on the planet. But it's also been a time for reflection, especially in America, on the very forces that brought this society together. What is democracy? What is enlightenment? And why does the fit between the two seem so strained and unstable in a world of so much discovery and material progress? How can we survive the chaos of the current phase of modernity when, more than ever, we need both science and democracy to work together in harmony? I'll be talking tonight from a repertoire of many decades of reflecting on these and related questions, so my remarks will necessarily be abbreviated and even sketchy, but I hope nonetheless to contribute some new thoughts to the milieu of this mature society, leaving room for all of us to recognize things that are not as yet dreamt of in our individual philosophies. The question of fit between how to know and how to govern has grown pointed during the COVID pandemic. It became an article of faith, especially in blue states like Massachusetts. And here I will share my screen and start showing you some pictures. So even in the lawn signs that I met walking around Cambridge, where I live, the nation's motto, "In God We Trust," gets appropriated here into an oath of fealty to scientific knowledge, incorporated in the man frequently described as the nation's top infectious disease expert. That confessional urge to believe in science rose to fever pitch during the 2020 election, so much so that during their victory speeches on Saturday, November 7th of last year, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were flanked by huge signs saying, the people have chosen science. But if the people did vote for science, did choose science in the election, it was by the thinnest of margins. The editor of one of the world's foremost science journals unhappily agreed with that assessment. Science was on the ballot, he observed, and this means that a significant portion of America doesn't want science. Science is now something for a subset of America. So there you see his comments, and it's been picked up as science having been on the ballot in the 2020 election. Now, that assessment is not exactly what the indicators about science and the people in America tell us. Surveys of public opinion consistently show a high degree of support, in principle, both for science and for spending money on science, public money. So one of the most reliable of these measures from the 2020 Science and Engineering Indicators compiled by the National Science Board in the US shows that over the last 20 years, something like 80 to 90% of the American people have consistently said yes to the propositions that science creates opportunities and science deserves public support. The kicker comes in the lines below those top approval signs. Some 50%, only 50% think that, some 50% think that science changes life too fast, and only about 45% have a great deal of confidence in the scientific community. In short, we might say that about half of the people think that science has become, in some sense, ungovernable, and that rather than scientific knowledge itself, that ungovernability is what strikes people as most worrisome. Is there reason to worry? Yes, of course. Developments in science and technology of the last quarter century have highlighted processes that were underway since long before the turn of the most recent century. It's a story, one might say, of greater and greater possibilities of control over the matter around us through the sciences of chemistry, physics, and biology, but arguably of less and less control over ourselves, especially as the information sciences and technologies of the latter half of the 20th century have begun converging with the physical sciences that ruled the technologies of the 19th and early 20th century. These achievements bring us to the heart of our constitutional dilemma. We've pondered long and hard for centuries on what gives the few the right to rule the many, but we've paid very little parallel attention to the question that now looms very large in public life. What gives the few the power to know for the many? That is a question that I hope to explore a bit further with you tonight. Because of this imbalance of attention, we have in effect set up parallel constitutional dispensations. On the one hand are explicit theories of delegation, political delegation, and we have the answers in written documents to many of these questions. Is power being exercised? Which powers are authorized? What are their limits? How do we know those limits? Who can challenge them? By what processes? And how should the people be represented in those processes, whether of approval or challenge? On the other side, there is a kind of parallel tacit delegation, questions of epistemic authority, and these quintessentially touch upon the relationship between power and knowledge. What happens to power and knowledge in a world that is ideally without borders, even though our constitutional governance stops at our territorial boundaries? How do we deal with a concept like epistemic subsidiarity, in which it's possible for communities and even nations to come to different conclusions about the knowledges that we have all generated in science and technology? What about far futures and imaginaries of where we ought to be headed with the scientific and technological capabilities at our command? How do we construct an idea of expertise, and where do ethics and responsibility flow in this world where experts have so much power of control over our lives? So science and technology not only chart out possibilities and opportunities for us, but much more deeply, living in scientific and technological societies implies that the notion of we the people itself has evolved and taken on different forms over the period of our constitutional democracy. And there are today two very different constructions of the people that are struggling to some degree for place in the political world. One of these is known in science and technology studies, my field, as the deficit model. In this version of reality, many people, much of the public, is seen as being in a constant deficit of knowledge and needing to be brought up to speed with more training in science. So my colleague Steven Pinker at Harvard, who is otherwise an optimist about human nature, frequently talks about the fact that the absence of science education, the absence of scientific knowledge, places many people at this kind of deficit about the world. So a baby sucks on a pencil and the panicky mother fears that the child will get lead poisoning, and on and on. These are just a few examples of scientific illiteracy. So people are seen as being illiterate in the very epistemic coin of the realm, and nourishing misconceptions that could have been avoided with a smidgen of freshman science. So, of course, you will note that this is also a verdict on higher education because it suggests that somehow we're not managing to get those smidgens into the heads of our university and college students. So that, again, is a rather pessimistic assessment from the public intellectual who perhaps more than any other is associated with a rosy future for humanity. So as against that, one can look at a very different model of citizenship that comes out of the progressive era, but is enshrined in a host of laws and regulations, particularly in the United States, but also in many other parts of the world. We can call this the model of the knowledge-able citizen. So not knowledgeable in the sense that our heads are already crammed full of facts, but citizens who have the capacity, if the facts are revealed to them, to know things in the right kinds of ways. And we see this knowledgeability idea, the presumption of knowledgeability, enshrined in an entire spectrum of laws that have been created or strengthened in the second half of the 20th century. So chief among them, right to know laws that tell us that we can find out about exposure to risks of all kinds, to know about what is in the material that we consume so that we can be informed consumers, laws that strive to level the economic and social and legal playing fields for all citizens. In biomedicine, we have very prominently the right to give informed consent. Throughout administrative law, a right to demand reasons for the ways in which states act, the right to participate and offer expertise, the right to challenge irrationality, and of course, the right to appeal. And so all of these things suggest that built quite deeply into our constitutional democracy is a notion that citizens are capable of knowledge, and that sits side by side in a quite contradictory way with this idea of the continually being in deficit, lacking the knowledge that we need to govern ourselves. Now, science and technology affect our subjectivity not only by setting up standards of rationality and who we should be as reasonable beings, but even where we are located as human subjects. So until recently, this was not much of a question. We knew that we were enclosed in our skins. We lived in our physical homes. We had doors and barriers to keep us safe. We were in a very physical and physically demarcated world. But with the advent of information science and technology, that view of the world has changed. And we have today, arguably, overlapping versions of the human subject that have been created through science and technology. Of course, the physical rendition of the human has not gone away. We still are physical beings, and we still sense things and feel things, including pain and anguish of different kinds. But at the same time, we have also become genetic selves that are composed of genetic information, and that information is lodged in various places throughout the biomedical, but also to some extent the commercial world. And more recently still, by virtue of our consuming habits, we've also become informational selves with data about our preferences and what we have done before, how we have consumed before, again, scattered all over the digital realm, and particularly in the control of the data oligarchs of the digital world. So how does law approach these issues? There are very few places where at least American constitutional law touches on this question of dispersed subjectivity. But here is one case, Riley versus California, which was a unanimous decision of the Supreme Court, in which Chief Justice Roberts came very close to a metaphysical understanding of some of the consequences of this dispersal. So, writing for the court, he said that cell phones play a central role in contemporary life. And these words are worth reading. They are, he said, such a pervasive and insistent part of daily life that the proverbial visitor from Mars might conclude that they were an important feature of human anatomy. So in this quotation, it's interesting that the Chief Justice recognizes that we are now, in effect, cyborg creatures, that some of our subjecthood is encapsulated in these machines that we have built as external, further additive pieces, components of ourselves. And yet he comes back to a rather physicalist notion of who we are anyway. That is, he comes back to the human anatomy. So something like that Cranach image of the person still dominates the Chief Justice's thinking. It's just that cell phones are now incorporated into that anatomy. A rather different, I think, constitutional imagination informs this European decision that is, I'm sure, well known to many people in this audience, the Google Spain decision. It involved a very ordinary person, Mario Costeja Gonzalez, and it involved a rather old and time-worn kind of story. The man had been in debt. Stories had appeared about his going to debtor's court, but because of the memory banks of the digital age, the newspaper report that talked about his being in debt always came up whenever his name was searched for. And Mr. Gonzalez claimed that this adversely affected his reputation, and he wanted to hold the internet search engine operator responsible for erasing this story, which he claimed no longer had any relevance to the person he was now at the time that the case arose. So it's interesting that legal commentators on the two sides of the Atlantic, to some extent, thought about this case in different ways. And I particularly like this juxtaposition between what Victor Mayer Schoenberger said, on the other hand, and I will soon cite what Jonathan Zittrain of Harvard Law School said. So Victor Mayer Schoenberger is a Viennese-trained lawyer who is an internet law expert in Oxford. And the day after the European Court of Justice decision came down, he talked about why he approved of a decision to recognize Mr. Gonzalez's claims. If you're always tied to the past, he said, it's difficult to grow, to change. Do we want to go into a world where we largely undo forgetting? So this is a view of the human subject that is not the cyborgian view, but it's tied to a sense of how the human persona develops and what kind of space it needs to grow into a personality in essence. And this is very different from Jonathan Zittrain's assessment of the same case. So whereas Victor Mayer Schoenberger was on the side of Mr. Gonzalez, advocating for a deletion of the bygone story, Jonathan Zittrain was focused on what this would mean pragmatically for the companies. So how an individual's reputation is protected online is too important and subtle a policy matter to be legislated by a high court, which is institutionally mismatched to the evolving intricacies of the online world. But if this is not a constitutional matter, if this does not concern subjectivity and rights at the constitutional level, then this opinion seems to suggest that it's more an administrative and regulatory matter, and implicit in there is a sign that the online world is perhaps a better regulator of itself because it is what is most knowledgeable about the evolving intricacies. So it's a short quotation, but it seems to embed within it both the regulatory philosophy that allowed the online world to come into being and grow into what it has become in a largely unregulated way, and a sense that the kind of personality evolution that matters to a Schoenberger is not the central issue that a Zittrain looks at when he looks at the same case. So this point that we live in different constitutional imaginaries, that people trained in the same profession, in law, sitting in different places, have different ideas when they look at the same set of issues. This is something that I'll come back to towards the very end of my talk. So moving on, the European Court of Justice sided with Schoenberger, as I've already indicated, but they created a new category of information. So basically, they said that reports on people like Mr. Gonzalez ought to be erased because that information appears to be inadequate, irrelevant, or no longer relevant, or excessive in relation to the purposes of the processing at issue. So some sense that we and our informational selves need to be, in some sense, in synchrony, that when the sync fails, then there is a memory bank being kept alive that is doing us an injustice, us as we have grown into being inside our own minds and in our own subjectivities and in our relationships. So the data point that is recorded, the news story that was reported, becomes such an inadequate marker of who we have become as people that it is no longer even a justifiable thing to keep alive. Now, this is a much more radical idea than the warrantless search of the cell phone that appeared in the Riley case. And I think they represent rather different ways of thinking of who we are as technologically served beings in this new era of digitalized space. A further point worth remarking on is that this self that is partly biological, partly informational, partly genetic, is incorporated into other systems of governance, not just other systems of governance that a constitutional order also has to take note of. So, we can go for genetic tests. In fact, recently, we've no doubt many of us gone for COVID booster shots to the commercial world that takes care of some of our health needs, and people are talking about all kinds of apps that contain our health data. Many people have Fitbits and other devices in which the data on what they practice and do on a daily level gets stored, creating an image of themselves. But these are private companies. They own pieces of our anatomical data and our physiological data. We have implants of different sorts that are informational. We have digitized cards. We have things that now can get incorporated into our physiology so that you can have a built-in sensor. You don't need a fingerprint anymore. You can be tracked if you allow yourself to have this built into you, neural enhancers of different sorts and prosthetics of different sorts. But these are all representing industrial addenda into which the selfhood that the distributed self is incorporated. And the question then becomes, well, what is our relationship to these worlds that all control pieces of ourselves? Now, we might have a discussion, how new or novel is this, but we can return to those sorts of questions later. And one thing is for sure, that in addition to ourselves becoming dispersed selves, we are accountable now to overlapping sovereignties. And this has been amply displayed in the course of the pandemic. So that pandemics have a regulatory role in life is well known, has been known since at least the turn of the previous century, and with the 100-year-old example of the Spanish flu, which resulted in these kinds of mass hospitals being set up and all kinds of rules and regulations. You can, if you're interested, go and find out what kinds of rules related to quarantining and masking and lockdowns during that earlier flu. But for sure, it too was a time when the public health enterprise exercised certain kinds of sovereign rights over our bodies, but they were different. They were different from the ways in which sovereignty is acting today and at present. One thing we see today, I think, is that there are two governance paradigms that are both at play in an episode like the pandemic that we've been going through. One is the well-known techno-scientific world's paradigm of risks. When we're in this framework of looking at things in connection with risks, there remains an implied commitment to scientific and technological progress and the adoption of technology, with a recognition that not every cost is bearable. So not at any cost, but only at costs that we as a society have deemed we are willing to bear and tolerate. This risk paradigm is focused on calculation, on harms that we can quantify, and harms to all different kinds of entities, so to other persons, to groups, to economies and environments. And this entire framework of governance depends on metrics, which are themselves expert products, data, indicators, statistics, probabilities, all of the things that we've been seeing displayed on the front pages of our papers now for close to 2 years. And how we cope is with policies of control, with containment, mitigation, and adaptation. But side by side with that, we still retain a governance paradigm that focuses on rights. And there, the commitment is not only to the prevention of harm, but also to protecting human needs and wants of a more varied sort. This paradigm of rights is focused on freedoms, freedom to accept or reject or shape technological worlds according to societal norms, the norms themselves taking precedence. This paradigm is dependent on normative institutions, the institutions of national and international law, and the policies are those of emancipation rather than control through actions such as declarations, codifications, and often the universalization of rights themselves, as in the system of human rights. So the public health world intrudes upon our rights regime to a very intimate degree. So here I have a quoted passage from the most recent health circular. I'm sure that many of us who are still working in institutions are seeing something like this. So this is a set of instructions for what we need to do in order to get through the Thanksgiving vacation in the US safely. We encourage COVID-19 testing 48 hours before your departure. So there's a temporal constraint, assuming that you're going to travel and it's telling you when you have to do it. Wear a mask. Well, we all know about wearing masks, but wear it properly. So there's another embedded layer of instructions. buried behind that. And then here's something quite unusual. Based on your own comfort level, you might choose to unmask in private indoor settings with family and close friends. This is a personal decision. But one might wonder why the public health regime is telling us what is a personal decision, if not as a tacit declaration that some other things are not personal decisions. So the subtext here is that some decisions are personal, but barely below the surface is the idea that the sovereignty of public health is still alive and well and watching over us. To reduce risks, remember to socialize thoughtfully. And then there are these new rules. I would be quite interested in knowing how many entities, other than Harvard, say, have organized these very rules and giving them names: the quick sip rule and the consume and cover rule. And then what you must tell your guests beforehand, that is individualizing the obligation to warn, which is in itself an intrusion on the autonomy of the self. And then for outdoor events, wear a mask when you are in crowded situations. Now here, the Harvard rule deviates from the Massachusetts and Cambridge city rules, which still do not specify that outdoors you must wear a mask in crowded situations. It's left much more discretionary. So this set of new little rules have already become materialized. So if, for instance, you work at my institution, the Kennedy School, there are every day and every week new little signs appearing all over the place. Now this one, consume and cover, I'm fairly sure that this is a novelty of the last 2 weeks. What it means is that as soon as you've finished eating at a table, you must put your mask back on. And that's what it's illustrating. But again, there are contradictions around, because this is the Kennedy School rule, but it certainly does not seem to apply to any of the restaurants within, a half-mile radius of Harvard. So one is living in these contradictory worlds where the messages are coming from different public health entities, refracted through different kinds of sovereignty, and creating a constant semblance of illegitimacy around almost every rule and almost every way in which we try to fit ourselves into a lawful world. Well, then, is it a surprise? Is it really a surprise that we find people picking up on some of these signals and engaging in demonstrations of this sort? This is a picture that in itself illustrates how these multiple sovereignties are being interpreted and priority given to one or another different aspect of the two governance regimes that I was talking about. So vaccines can cause injury and death. In itself, not false, misleading without any numbers attached, but can it happen? Yes, of course, it can happen. Vaccine mandates violate bodily autonomy? Well, yes, but isn't the question something else that people are pointing to, namely, who has the authority to strike that balance? They're not placebo safety tested, that happens to be right. And then this sign in the back are made with aborted fetal cells, suggests that very different systems of rights are being overlaid on top of the public health sovereignty right, which presumes to have unilateral sovereignty over what we can do as bodies. So this is, of course, a typically American scene. It's happening in America, but I think it illustrates how the different kinds of contradictions of the overlapping sovereignties and overlapping subjectivities I'm describing result in sets of contradictions that enable political action that may strike some of us as completely out of bounds, and yet there are alternate ways of constructing the world in which these actions obviously appear legitimate. So the last thing I want to say is that all of these constitutional ways of understanding who we are in a world that is continually fractionating us are overlaid onto cultural ways of knowing that create huge cross-cultural divergences in how we think of ourselves as constitutional societies and beings embedded in constitutional orders. So this comes out of a very long and detailed study I did of the ways in which biotechnology and biotechnological knowledge have been incorporated into the expert worlds of the US, Britain, and Germany. Now, you would think that these three countries would be so much alike that when a new technological development comes along, like the biotechnologies of the last 50 years, that they would respond in the same way. But in fact, they have not responded in the same way. And you go technology by technology and find quite far-reaching differences in the degree of acceptance that each has achieved in these countries, and also the degree of contestation that surrounds the uptake of these technologies. So if you start digging, you find that this is partly related to the ways in which we go about constructing public knowledge in the first place. In other words, the tacit constitutionalism of what is good knowledge for this particular democracy operationalizes itself in very different understandings of who is the right kind of expert and how do we go about constructing knowledge. So in the United States, we have typically accepted the idea that robust knowledge is constructed through pluralist and interest-based contestation among groups that have stakes in a political system. So the expert position is something that has to transcend that pluralism and those sets of interests. And so you find repeatedly in the US, going down to the very bottom of that column, and a reliance on formal methods and on quantitative modes of analysis that is quite different from what you encounter in both Britain and Germany. In Britain, the best expert, the expert that the public trusts, comes with a CV, a long-standing embodied demonstration that the expert is not only knowledgeable, but also has performed services for the nation in a variety of ways. And you could look at the British Birthday Honours List as an exemplification of the fact that some citizens are elevated above other citizens in this elite producing society because they have performed services to the state. So even when an actor, for instance, is knighted, you find that it is for services to the profession and to the practice of acting that has won recognition outside of the nation or in very special ways. And you find this down the line through, every kind of activity for which citizens are honored and knighted in Britain. One of the things that happened during the Tony Blair government was that the whole practice of how you nominate people for birthday honors became democratized. But what didn't get dislodged was the idea that it would still be an embodied conception of who would stand for the society in the role of being an expert. Both Britain and the US create particular people as exemplars. So we have in Fauci, we trust, and in Britain, the people may not be individually celebrities in the same way, but they are people who, as I was suggesting, are recognized as individuals. Whereas in Germany, it's extremely rare, and you just have to take it as an assertion for now, that individual experts become publicly known and are continually appearing on things like talk shows and so on. Instead, it's institutions. So it's one of the sort of demonstrations of how institutional Germany is, that over the COVID pandemic, the German Ethics Council actually won a national award for the services rendered to the nation on discussing public ethics during the COVID era. It's like giving the Hastings Center in America a medal for doing institutional analysis and ethics. It just would not happen. You can't imagine it happening in the US. So if you look through across these countries at their practices of how they incorporate expertise into their political systems, you find the working out in detail of these tacit constitutional assumptions that I was speaking of at the beginning of the talk. Does it have consequences? Of course, it has consequences, and two images will illustrate what I mean. So when the political and constitutional, the epistemic and the political orders are in sync, you will get images of obedience, by and large, of consensus. And this is from a picture in Kuwait where people were lined up. And when they're not in sync, you will get demonstrations of this sort, which come, as I'm sure you can recognize, from Michigan at the height of the rebellion against Governor Whitmer's attempts to maintain tight control over the mobility of infected people during COVID. But the very juxtaposition of images like this shows that we are in this world of divergent civic epistemologies, divergent ways of adopting the very idea of expertise into our constitutional systems and into our understandings of who we are as citizens in this world of multiple and overlapping selves and sovereignties. So the what is to be done question, I think that this kind of analysis opens up a huge number of questions of how we rethink the place of science in democracy and in constitutional democracy in particular. As a theoretical matter, I think one has to start with recognizing the constructedness of the worlds that we make, that these are interpenetrating worlds with both natural and social constitutions that to some extent define and reorder each other. In my discussion of the dispersed self, I hope I made that clear to some extent. What should we be doing? We have to rethink the possibilities of this mutually constructed world, and we have then to act to make opportunities realizable. For that, I think we have to set aside the preordained boundaries that we have constructed between important categories of thought. We are to some extent doing that already. So for instance, faith and science are usually kept apart in different boxes, but if Cambridge, Mass is awash with signs saying in Fauci we trust, one might wonder where that boundary between faith and science has actually gone, between thought and action, between, above all, private and public, and between lay and expert. For this, I think we need to cross disciplinary lines in our educational systems, but in a much more imaginative way than I think we have done. We've assumed that the disciplines stay fixed and that people move across. I think we have to imagine instead that the disciplines themselves are mobile and that they have to move in order to accommodate our imagination of alternative futures. And then, of course, all of this is a prelude to justice. And ultimately, if we recognize that there is this deep interpenetration between our rational world and our normative world, then we have a basis for demanding and, in some extent, designing new pathways into the future. That is the future that I think of as the second enlightenment and the task of the active life as a new Hannah Arendt might have imagined it. So with that, let me thank you and return to our more collective format.
Sheila, thank you very much for that extremely stimulating talk, and I'm sure we'll have many questions. I'll lead off with a question and also a comment that I'd like your comment on. So many of us say, and it's easy to say, that the culture war that's grown up over the public health measures for curbing the pandemic are sort of Donald Trump's fault, that had he not made masking into an issue and, done the things that we all know that he did and that he said, we wouldn't be living in this kind of divided country, red states trying to make it illegal to have a mask requirement in blue states, But listening to your talk, it seems to me that maybe too easy a judgment, maybe even a judgment that gives us false comfort. Oh, if only not for Donald Trump, we'd be in a much better place with this. And so my question is, do I understand you correctly to say that what is manifest now in the response to the pandemic is something, much deeper than any particular political leader? My comment that I'd like your comment on is the first vaccine mandate case to reach the Supreme Court didn't get much attention because the Supreme Court didn't actually do anything. This was back in August. It was from Indiana, and Indiana University had issued a vaccine mandate for students, and some students brought a lawsuit, and they said, this violates our personal autonomy. And they were represented by a well-known Indiana lawyer who, what he's well known for is kind of leading the charge against Roe against Wade, against the right to abortion, where, of course, the claim on the abortion rights side is it's a matter of women's autonomy, that they can choose not to become mothers. And I just thought it was extremely ironic that this lawyer representing these students claiming the right to personal autonomy not to have to be vaccinated, was the same person. So one is my question, are we too facile in thinking, oh, if only we didn't have Trump, we'd be living in a better world? And secondly, I'd just like your thoughts on the multiple uses of the concept of autonomy.
Well, those are deep and difficult questions or comments, Linda. But as far as Trump is concerned, I think many of us would agree that we would be better off if we hadn't had Trump. But the question isn't that. It's more, why did we get a Trump? Because the same person can be both a force for propelling things in a certain direction, a very major force, and yet a person who crystallizes the pre-existing historical forces that made that person come into being in the first place. So why is it that this country is split 50-50, which, of course, has been the case for a good long time? I mean, that is, that we shouldn't forget the 2000 election, which didn't pit a Trump against a Clinton, but did pit a Bush against a Gore. And Gore stood for the voices of reason, for the right course of action on climate change. That was something that he had embraced, at a time when many other politicians were reluctant to do. But so in that sense, it was a collective and responsible science-grounded vision of who we should be and what kinds of things we should be putting priority on as a polity that bumped up against a person who was seen as a bit of a playboy, a lightweight, and not anti-science actively, but that George W. Bush administration actually came to be seen as anti-science to maybe not quite the same degree as the Trump administration. So we're talking about several decades of history and something that has been unraveling since the unraveling of the progressive era, and in effect. I mean, so there was some kind of a progressive consensus through the first half of the 20th century, but after that, things started to some degree falling apart. And, so I think Trump's election and all of the things that came with it, no doubt ratcheted up and speeded up the dissolution of those forms of order. But one might ask, what is it about the rationalist view of how to govern that provokes, in a way, that backlash? I mean, I think that whenever there is a backlash, one might ask, what is it a backlash against? And I think that there one can point to the failures of the widespread rationality as well. So in the economics domain, this is talked about and written about more than we need to discuss tonight. But globalization was supposed to raise all boats. It didn't raise all boats. It only selectively raised boats. And maybe those of us who can afford it, got cheap commodities, but it was at the expense of people who lost livelihoods and were thrown out of work. Now, I've been doing a huge comparative study of COVID policies across 16 countries. And the countries divide up between those that have decided economically to protect jobs in this crisis and those that have just decided to put money into the pockets of people, but not preserve the jobs. So by and large, the consensus around policy has been much higher in the countries that decided to protect labor and to protect the labor market arrangements than the countries in which a different decision was made and companies were left to decide, what they wanted their employment structure to look like, after the pandemic. So to some extent, it's who is the self, the subject that the constitutional order is being protective of, and if selectively we're doing something about the pandemic, but not doing something about the economic pandemic that's happening at the same time and the political pandemic that's happening at the same time, that these three overlapping systems of politics, economics, and health are riding together, then you can sort of understand the backlash to some extent as people saying, well, you haven't taken care of us here, how can we believe you there? So to the extent people are saying, well, you made the regulatory structures, you said double blind and placebo, and now you're doing this other thing. I mean, of course, people like us, specifically you and me, might decide that we want to be clinical trial subjects because we want to generate the data in essence, and because we believe in, that way of doing science. But others can look at the same thing and see that out of commercial motivations, in part, regulations are being scrapped. They can see that Moderna executives are perhaps unjustly enriching themselves. They can see that public money went into developing the vaccine, but who is benefiting at the other end? So, something about the political credibility of the scientific system is at stake. And that is something that I think Mr. Trump was able to make hay out of. As far as the autonomy point is concerned, I mean, of course, there are deep contradictions in all of these right of center movements that you've written about so well, but one can't forget that there is this question of the status of the fetus that is different between the vaccinated body and the abortion case. I mean, I think what the political right has been extremely clever about doing is elevating the relative rights of the fetus compared with the adult human female. This has not been the case in other countries. I mean, so in Britain, where the Warnock Committee, established its 14-day rule, the status of the early embryo was morally resolved with a degree of permanency that it just has not been resolved here. And when I was doing my other comparative study of biotech policies, sometime in the course of that study, it just struck me that there just was not a sort of coming together of women's movement and abortion rights in Britain with anything like the fervor that you saw in the US and Germany. In Germany, it was for different reasons, because East and West Germany had different ideologies with regard to abortion. It became the sticking point around reunification. But I think that it's a case that involves not just one life, but multiple lives, and the status, who gets to declare what the status of that second, the emergent life will be, and at what point. That has become another of these polarizing issues in this country. And we do not have the mechanisms to resolve that in a way that will, say, can't we just be sensible the way a Warnock Committee did and decide that we're going to draw a bright line, and before it is one thing and after it is a different thing.
Well, thank you for taking that on. Okay, Mary Miller. I was recently in a meeting where we heard that the word science polls very badly with Americans. The word art polls almost equally poorly. I'm not very interested in polls, Mary says, but your talk raises questions about expertise and the roles of experts, all of which seem to underpin a deep skepticism of science on both the right and the left. This, of course, is even more profound in the arts and humanities. It's a rich time to be in the practice of revision, but the anger about this on both the left and the right is astounding. Would you talk a little bit about the challenge of bringing study and learning to the table? And before you answer, I'll just remind people that it was 18 months ago that the APS as a body adopted a resolution for the first time in decades and decades, adopting any resolution on a public matter, asking the Congress to create, to enact a new version for the 21st century, what it did in the Cold War, the National Defense Education Act, which channeled a bunch of federal money into the schools for science and also social science and humanities education, and had a big effect, actually. It supported foreign language learning, it supported math learning, and we thought it's needed now as much as it was needed then, if not more. Of course, Congress did not respond, but it was a kind of a mobilizing moment for the APS. So just to rephrase to repeat the question Mary ended up with, would you talk a little bit about the challenge of bringing study and learning to the table?
Well, so Mary, if it's a question about bringing science or scientific study and learning to the table, I mean, at least where I sit, it's the arts and the humanities that are desiccating, and people are voting with their feet to do more science. I mean, so STEM is not exactly riding low at the moment, and particularly with information science and technology and data science, there's an enormous rush into the scientific and technological fields. I think that what is happening along with that is a kind of arrogation of moral responsibility by the sciences and technologies, and an inability to sort of recognize where we're not merely doing science, we're inquiring into alternative ways of future making, in effect. And that much more complex bringing of worlds into being needs people brought along, and we don't seem to have the adequate mechanisms for that job. So, just look at the recent disclosures by Frances Haugen of what's going on at Facebook. I don't know how many people were surprised. I mean, the particular form of the particular misdeeds, I mean, like knowing about adolescent girls and their body images, but I was hearing about those data long before these disclosures. But the question is, why did we allow that to appear? I mean, it's an economic ideology that was embraced by people in Silicon Valley, that regulation holds us back, that we should allow technology to bulldoze ahead, because it's only technology. And only when it starts having impacts, only then are we responsible for doing the cost-benefit analyses and seeing what the impacts are. But surely in a period where Facebook has announced it has its own Supreme Court as of a couple of years ago, we see that the development of these sciences and technologies, or of technoscience as people call it, is not just a matter of neutrally developing instruments and means and then applying them to our normative lives, that the norms are embedded in there in the first place. So I think people to some extent see that, but I mean, this is just a very long conversation. I mean, I don't think that we acknowledge that in the ways in which we bring the sciences to the table. I mean, there still is a kind of arrogance that by understanding how nature behaves, even though good scientists will always say it's a very partial and provisional understanding, nevertheless, there's, when you look out at the world, it is still the superior form of knowledge. So, I think that the reason that I talk about constitutionalism is that I think we have to start thinking about deliberation and where we do the deliberation. I mean, there are outcomes that I'm fervently in favor of, and yet recognize that the very ways in which we've gone about achieving those outcomes has produced consequences that threaten to swallow up the outcome. I mean, Roe v. Wade is a perfect example of that. I mean, what woman of my rough age and status is not a thorough advocate of Roe v. Wade? But, who would have imagined that a decision that feels so clearly right and, 50 years on would be in danger of being dismantled? I mean, surely it should be much more settled than it was when Sandra Day O'Connor said it was settled, back in Casey. So one has to admit that we made some mistakes in imposing our visions of what was scientifically informed rightness on other parts of the world, and try to understand what that disagreement comes from. I mean, I guess that's the sort of thing that, and, so what learning do we bring to the table? It's to some extent this interpretive learning of where is it that the normative is getting so mixed up with the epistemic and factual that, and yet we haven't disentangled it. And then people see the contradictions and confusions and behave in ways that we would rather not have.
Howard Gardner has a question. Your comparison of the US, Germany, and Britain was intriguing. Of course, the chart would have been quite different in 1935. Can you discuss the sources and longevity of these trends?
Yeah, well, the longevity, I think it depends on what sort of trends you're talking about, Howard. I mean, if you're a Charles Taylor, you see social imaginaries coming up maybe in 100-year or more cycles. I guess as an STS scholar, I'm interested in the practices by which belief systems become more or less deeply embedded into society. And one can start thinking about those phenomena. So there's no doubt that post-war constitutional Germany, to some extent, has constituted itself as corporatist, but the corporatist inclinations long predated, right? I mean, you can go back to the kind of social welfare systems that a Bismarck was constructing and see there some of the institutional roots of the ways in which Germans still do business. The desire not to have leading figures and not to have people who epitomize the virtues of the society. I mean, that obviously can be seen as an allergic reaction to the period that you're talking about. And now when Angela Merkel stepped down, a long-running leader of a country that has had an allergy toward leadership, but a leader who was acknowledged for her very absence of charisma. I mean, you see, a sort of performance that is a theatricalized version of history in a way. But these performances then become subsequent performances as well. I mean, that is the fact that Merkel did what she did and was able to pull the country through COVID, as people say, to some extent that is in and of itself a further thing to build into the history of Germany. Those are the kinds of phenomena that interest me, this sort of continual performance, reperformance, and rules being somewhat recrafted. I mean, that's what gives us the idea of a living constitution to some extent, right?
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's after 8, so we do have to wrap up. Appreciate your talk very much.